Thank you very much all for being here today, both in person and online. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that today we meet on Aboriginal land of the Darug people, and also pay my respects to elders past and present and extend those respects to Aboriginal people who are here today. So let's start with the question, why a review and why a literature review for gifted education? As Rowena mentioned, the literature review is something that is connected to and was part of the development process of the department's new high potential and gifted education policy. The previous policy was released in 2004, and in the sort of 15 years that have passed, this is one of those areas in education where there had been some really significant new and different research and some new findings to come out that will really help inform, but also perchance give us an opportunity to reflect on our current practices and to have a think about the best ways that we can use some of the effective and research practices in our teaching. In today's presentation, I'm going to just sort of tease out a couple of key points from the literature review and a few sort of just interesting tidbits. It's something that I'd encourage you all to read and to take a look to be able to dive a bit deeper into the research. When we undertake a major literature review like this, it involves a lot of reading, a really significant amount of reading. In my count of all of the different articles, research pieces, journal articles and things that we went through, the count was over 1,000 studies that we looked at to try and help inform the research for this literature review. And that's because we wanted to make sure that both for the policy, but also teachers and school leaders are equipped with the best quality research possible, and especially using high quality studies that really show and have relevance to our contexts in New South Wales public schools. In some of those changes that have occurred, as I'll outline today, we've got a much stronger evidence base now on some of the effective practices for gifted students, really looking at the practices that work, that promote strong, positive academic, but also social and wellbeing outcomes for students. Talent development and a bit of a focus on high potential students, perhaps a broader definition of students who have the capacity to achieve highly, is another key thing. And also a message that I think is very close to the hearts of many in this room, far more significant research around students from more diverse backgrounds, especially students from disadvantaged backgrounds and their types of experiences in accessing advanced learning. As I mentioned, the policy, the High Potential and Gifted Education Policy, was released by the department early in June, and the literature review has been a piece of work in that project. The aim of the document is to try and help support the development of the policy, to provide an evidence base for what goes into the policy, but to also support the work of schools, teachers, school leaders to help implement parts of the policy and provide some background for professional learning as well for teachers and school leaders. The development of the high potential gifted education policy certainly at times probably felt a little bit trying. It was a multi-year project that had many starts and stops, and as sometimes happens, has a lot of other frustrations along the way. But a really great hard-working team as part of the Learning and Teaching Directorate are now tasked with the implementation of the policy and supporting schools to familiarise themselves with some of the key things that flow through. Why the policy? The policy certainly responds to some of the emerging trends and some of the different findings and issues that we face in our education system. One of those, to just choose one example from the many data sets that we have, showed a concerning decline in the percentage or number of students on some international measures, but also some of our local, national and state measures for the percentage of students able to demonstrate high achievement in various domains. In this case, this was the PISA assessments, looking at 2015, a significant drop in the percentage of students who were able to demonstrate achievement in the high achievement range, or the highest band, for PISA maths, science and reading. Critically, underlying a lot of this data, some of those slips and changes are particularly noticeable for students from more disadvantaged backgrounds. I'll talk more about that issue of excellence gaps in a later slide, but what we saw increasingly was a smaller number of students able to demonstrate that higher level of attainment on some of these measures. It also connected up with things such as the Premier's top two bands, Premier's priorities, top two bands for literacy and numeracy, as well as trying to work and support the department's strategic plan about supporting high achievement and ensuring that all students from all backgrounds have an opportunity to reach their educational potential. Additionally, over this time since the first policy, there's been quite a lot in the popular psychology field. Some of you might be familiar with some of these book titles that kind of went through in the 2000s and even the last 10 years. Sometimes, unfortunately, popular psychology can make things like high achievement sound easy. It often gets boiled down in the media to just one factor. It might be grit or mindset or just the amount of work that you do, motivation, talent, opportunity, whatever that might be. It's certainly something that has been thought-provoking, and sometimes I think within schools it's easy to latch on to these things. We hear a lot about them in the media, we hear them discussed and talked about amongst friends and peers, but in reality a broader view of research into high achievement presents a much more complex figure, that it's not just one of these things that is the sudden solution to why some students are able to achieve highly and why not. Rather, it's very complex. And when we throw in issues of social and educational disadvantage, it can become even more complex. I'd like to introduce you to the concept of talent development, which is certainly one of the new developments in the research field. Previously, gifted education looked a little bit more broadly at the concept of gifted and talented students. Now, the focus on effective practices really looks at the types of educational and developmental opportunities that help students reach high achievement. If we define gifted students as being students with the potential to achieve highly, then we want to be able to ensure that in our practices and our programs, that's what's supported as an outcome. They're really consistent themes in the research literature and across a broad range of subjects, key learning areas, human pursuits and endeavours can boil down to some of these very common factors. On the right is probably the most important, particularly when we talk about students from disadvantage, and that is having the opportunities to learn. What we see consistently in parts of Australia and also around the world is that students from more disadvantaged backgrounds often don't have access to the advanced learning opportunities that exist out there. While universities or sometimes out-of-school opportunities might provide ways for students to access advanced learning, it could be through holiday camps, weekend activities, after-school things. Ultimately, a lot of them cost money, may involve travel, and sometimes parents just simply need to know that they exist. So thus the research shows that for a lot of our disadvantaged students, they're much more likely to rely on schools to provide these talent development opportunities. Some of the consistent messages also really tap into other parts of education research that we're familiar with in the department. Things like having high expectations for our learners, ensuring that learning is challenging and that extends students from their current level of mastery. Also too, something that is very different to what I was taught in part of my study, a real focus on things like explicit teaching. Gifted students, while they may appear to be, have quite strong and high levels of ability for students their age, they still have some of the limitations around working memory and the challenges in processing often new and complex information, especially for their age. That's a very different message to some of the things I learnt in my teacher education, which seem to suggest very much the opposite. Deliberate practice is another one, and it's a hard one to avoid because it is about, in many of the areas of talent development, it requires investments of time, effort, work, feedback, and quality teaching and learning opportunities. That's still something that is really difficult to avoid and is a part of that longer term view of how we develop talent. The literature review provides some summaries and some examples from the research base on what some of the different effective practices are that probably more specifically relate to the needs of gifted students as ways of helping to provide that advanced learning that is quite often beyond the typical level expected of students the same age, either their grade, current syllabus, even stage and beyond. The real strong overall message from these points is it is often about matching the learning experience, the level of challenge, depth and complexity and pace required for students, matching that learning experience with the needs of the learner. So in all of these practices, things like curriculum acceleration, some of the grouping programs, extension and enrichment are about providing more challenging, difficult, sometimes faster paced learning so that students get that sense of challenge and are able to work hard and work towards developing their talent. To give some examples, just to tease out one or two things and studies that are covered in the literature review, academic and curriculum acceleration amongst all of these effective practices probably has the strongest and most secure evidence base in terms of the number of studies, the quality and rigour methodologically of the studies, and also the way that they've been replicated across many different cultural and national contexts. Academic acceleration remains significantly underused. It's not a very frequent thing for students to potentially skip ahead a grade, either in one subject or sometimes in all of their subjects. To give an example of one of the studies and the outcomes there, this was a US-based study, a large data set that undertook a propensity matching analysis exercise, essentially taking students with common starting characteristics, prior achievement, demographic and personal characteristics, and being able to match and compare students who undertook a full year acceleration, they essentially skipped a year at some point in primary school, and students who, again, very, very similar, but did not have that acceleration opportunity. To just give a little bit of a summary of some of the particular academic differences there, researchers found very significant, both statistically and practically significant differences in the academic outcomes of those students longitudinally. That was tracking students all the way through to the end of secondary school in the US, through to college entry, and then even into their undergraduate study. Much higher levels of their grade point average in high school, the ASAT and SATs, which are sort of similar to, I guess, the types of scores used for university entry in the US, significantly higher effect sizes there as well, even higher probability of earning a bachelor's degree through that process. This is just one of the hundreds and hundreds of studies that support the use of curriculum acceleration for gifted students. Yet for many teachers, parents and people in the community, it can be something we butt up against and feel maybe a little bit uncomfortable about because we could be concerned about either social or emotional issues. Generally, the research is very sound on that as well. Interestingly, as I was sort of reflecting on the weekend, this is a very common practice in the sporting world, often in music and creative arts. As I was watching the cricket on the weekend, watching Steve Smith batting, I went back and checked. Yes, he was playing grade cricket in the UK, age 17, with men. He spent a fair bit of his time and development playing up a year or two in regular tournaments and things like that. Even in another sport, Samantha Kerr is particularly notable, not just for the fact that in her development in playing soccer, she's a representative in the Australian women's team. In her training and development, she spent a lot of time not just playing with students older than her and not just often playing in boys' competitions, but playing in boys' competitions with other students who are older than her, because that was the level of challenge that she needed to be able to develop her skill. It was only at that level could she find people that she could fairly compete against. In sport, we do that all the time and we often celebrate the outcomes of that, but in the school and academic world, we can sometimes feel a little bit less comfortable. The point is, though, is that it's one of those things where the evidence really strongly supports the practice. Also, another key thing centres around the importance of teachers. In education research, I always feel a little bit proud as a teacher when we see that teachers are a solution to the problem, but also I just keep thinking that every time we come across research, it comes down into teaching and teaching practices and the real importance of teachers. That's great, but that's also a significant challenge for us as well. Even just comparing the academic outcomes of students involved in this case in enrichment, curriculum enrichment activities, comparing the academic outcomes of students who had teachers with experience and training working with high ability students compared to teachers who did not, there was a significant difference in the academic outcomes. Part of the reason why is because for some teachers and for many, there is a reasonably specialist skill set involved in helping to extend students beyond their current age level. For some teachers, that may even be taking them out of their particular curriculum area or even stage of learning, like primary teachers having to help students work towards secondary outcomes, or secondary teachers essentially helping students with university level learning. Also too, some of the research shows that for many teachers are not equipped with their skills or professional learning to help gifted students, because typically this doesn't always form a part of their pre-service teacher education. In one of the recent studies, and I've gone back to sort of check this, about 3 of the 49 or so universities in Australia that offer pre-service teacher education, only around 3 have a gifted education elective or subject as part of their pre-service teaching. That's a real concern because that often means that a lot of teachers are essentially graduating or moving into the workforce perhaps without the full set of skills or awareness of the research and the ways in which they can really help make a difference for gifted students from all backgrounds. I'd like to talk about the background issue now here and bring to your attention the concept of excellence gaps. Some very significant research has occurred especially in the USA, but also replicated in parts of Europe and around the world to see the differences in educational outcomes between students from more advantaged backgrounds and students from far less advantaged or disadvantaged backgrounds. While typically our discussions of that in policy and society often relate to things like the average scores or sometimes the percentage of students reaching a minimum standard, those gaps exist for the percentage of students who are achieving at the top end as well. I've just chosen 2 examples here to illustrate. I could pick one of any from just about any of the data sets in Australia to show the differences in achievement between students from low and high advantage backgrounds in relation to high achievement. In this case here, the top 2 bands for reading in Year 9 or the Peace and Maths top bands as well. When we equate that out into numbers of students, that is literally tens of thousands of students each year with very differing levels of achievement. Unfortunately, a lot of this can be attributed to levels of social disadvantage and inequity that exists in our society. However, research also shows, and some of the more significant research of the last 10 years really shows that also some of this can be attributed to differing opportunities to learn, in that for many disadvantaged students, they don't always have the same educational opportunities, either outside of school, like I mentioned before, or in school, to be able to access advanced learning, to be able to connect with higher levels of curriculum or more challenging learning experiences. In some cases, it can also come down to the quantity of opportunities to learn. Again, fewer opportunities to learn accumulated over the course of a 12 or 13-year school experience can really start to add up. And so that's where we, as educators and the many great people who work in our public education system, have a really significant role. Because again, the research shows that for many of these students and their families, they're much more likely to rely on schools, on us, to be able to provide those opportunities, to be able to provide the guidance, the practices, and the things that are really going to make a difference to help close these excellence gaps in our society. We can see this in some of our other data sources as well. This is an example from CESE's Tell Them From Me survey and looks at the percentage of high-performing students reporting high expectations for success and comparing students in the high SES and low SES quartile. This one was particularly interesting for me, and also as a high school English teacher made me give a little bit of pause as well to see that there is a small gap for students in Year 4, 5 and 6 in terms of the percentage of high achievers reporting high expectations of them. What was particularly noticeable was how the overall percentage dropped once students entered Years 7, 8 and 9 in high school. Especially noticeable was the gap between high SES and low SES students when it came to the percentage of students that reported high expectations of them. That gap really opened up. And as a high school teacher, that gave me significant pause for thought about, the types of things that I've been involved in my career and the sorts of expectations that I had within my faculty and some of my school teams to ensure that we were not just providing high expectations in learning, but that we were consistent and that we didn't judge a student based on their background and potentially limit their educational opportunities as a result. This is also seen in some of the other pieces of research around the world, but also here in New South Wales. Last year, I was fortunate to be involved and lead some of the research components of the department's review of selective education access, the review into the selective high school and opportunity class programs, to get a sense of and a better understanding of the representations of students in these advanced learning programs. One of the key lessons we learned from research around the world was that you can't just simply assume that all students will even apply for advanced learning opportunities. Here, in this example, if you look at a comparative Year 6 cohort, 30% of all Year 6 students come from family backgrounds with higher levels of education, bachelor's degrees or higher in the family. For those 30% of students, those students made up 59% of applicants for selective high schools. For students from lower levels of parental education, in this case, parents with no post-school education, they make up 26% of students in the public education system, yet only made up 11% of applicants. Things like this give us a real sense of where some of the drivers and why sometimes we see a real difference in the representation of students from diverse backgrounds in advanced learning programs. We can see this also, and there are similar stats exist out there for things like representations in some of the more, I guess, what you would call top-end universities in Australia, show some very similar patterns, both in terms of applications and the representations of students in there. So that's an interesting one for us to sort of think about, and as potentially we need to think about within school context to ensure that we're encouraging students and providing opportunities. We can't just assume that all parents will know about the advanced learning opportunities out there, and certainly not all students may have parents who are really strong advocates and who are at the school, who are on the phone or at the school gate or front office campaigning hard for these things. This is where we need to potentially make better use of some of the achievement data that exists in our system to ensure that we're able to identify students from diverse backgrounds and help match them with the right learning opportunities. That's also something that potentially we can do at school level. This is an example, a very famous example of a study conducted in Florida public schools and Broward County, a large, very culturally diverse public school district in Florida, just north of Miami, where instead of asking either students and parents to apply for a gifted education or getting teachers to nominate which students should go forward for assessment, the school brought in screening. They assessed all students on an opt-out basis instead of an opt-in basis. So it made it optional for students to do it, but by default, everybody did it. That dramatically changed the cultural and social background and makeup of the students who were assessed and placed in gifted education programs. So that's a piece of advice I'd certainly take back in my teaching career, but also with schools, is that when you are looking for gifted students, don't just necessarily take those who apply or those who put up their hand, but try and assess as large and as broad a range as you can. Additionally, and I'll just talk very quickly to these because there's some more detail in the literature review, we have increasing quantity and quality of research into the specific learning needs of students from some diverse backgrounds that sometimes aren't always represented as highly as we would like in advanced learning or gifted education programs. For gifted students with an Aboriginal background, there are some issues that we need to consider in terms of cultural sensitivity and assessment, ensuring that the education programs feel culturally safe and inclusive, but also recognising sometimes the more diverse ways and characteristics that students from an Aboriginal background may present with their ability. For students from more diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds as well, we have a lot of students who potentially are facing the challenge of learning a second language while still trying to engage with more advanced learning needs. And that can provide significant degrees of frustration for many students as they suddenly feel a bit slow as they're learning in a completely different language background to what they may be used to. One of the other things that has a very strong and clear research base, but it's a new inclusion in our high potential and gifted education policy, centres around gifted students with disability. Recognising that we do have students with very high levels of cognitive and creative ability, but also can have a coexisting disability that might inhibit their learning and achievement. That may mean that they have a very diverse and complex set of learning needs that require support. Both support and additional assistance with their disability and what that means within the learning and assessment process, but also ensuring that they've got access and opportunities to access advanced learning to assist with their talent development as well. Finally, for gifted students in regional and remote areas, we have the very complex and double issue when it comes to both the types of social and economic disadvantage faced by many students in regional and remote areas, but also sometimes the tyranny of distance that is involved in helping students access physically, let alone now virtually, some of the advanced learning opportunities that exist around the state. If you just think in terms of what the research says about the need for deliberate practice, the time spent learning, getting feedback, lessons, whatever that might be, just simply spending that kind of time in the car, constantly driving long distances to access those advanced learning opportunities, again, can be a cumulative disadvantage for lots of students. I'm really proud of some of the work that's happening in the department to help address that through many of the different programs in schools, and also some of our systemic programs like Aurora College and distance education, for example, to ensure that students right across our very large and diverse state are provided with as many opportunities as they can to reach their potential. To me, that's really the overarching message from today's presentation and also from the literature review. It's about helping to marry up and connect the evidence base on what we have in terms of effective practices that will make a difference for gifted students, but particularly to help ensure that all students from all backgrounds, if they have that kind of high potential, that they are given the opportunities, support and development to help them reach high levels of high achievement. And that's really helping to deliver on a promise that we have central to our public education system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was terrific. We've got about 10 minutes now for questions.
Thanks for the talk. So just another question on acceleration. One of the concerns people may have around acceleration is that one, a student may be cognitively developed, but in terms of social and emotional development, they might not be as developed in those areas, and that in order to support that, they need to be with peers that are of similar age. And that if they're accelerated to people who have peers that are much older than them, there becomes almost a generational gap, and that's stymies some of that social and emotional development. What does the literature say around that?
Yes, that's a really commonly held belief, and sort of does help get to the reason why many parents, teachers, principals often feel uncomfortable with curriculum acceleration. Research into the way in which students form and develop friendships shows that one of the really key issues as to how students make friends is centred around common interests, but also the level of complexity or sophistication that they explore that interest. So for some students, it might be sport, for example, or a particular sport or teams that they follow. But if you look at sort of the way 7-year-olds follow a sport and the way 17-year-olds follow a sport, there usually are some differences there. And that's one of those key things. If the students are cognitively advanced, but sort of working with students who may not be at the same level in terms of their cognitive or thinking skills, then it can actually be hard for those students to form social things, which is why some of those students can appear to be a little less developed social and emotionally. They've not had friends that are on the same level as them, that are able to play and engage in games at the same level of complexity, and sometimes can get frustrated, get annoyed, want to withdraw and stick to individual activities. So the research shows in those examples often helping students match with a peer group that might not be the same age, but is at a similar stage in terms of their cognitive development, can actually improve their social outcomes. However, like with all examples, it requires some support. You know, just simply taking a student from year 4 and placing them into a year 6 classroom is not necessarily going to end well, as we would typically expect. So like a lot of interventions in education, it comes down to how it's done, and that can really make that difference.
Thank you, Ben. My question is about your examples that you've given to for all the different studies, that a lot of them are in America. Are there large studies in Australia that actually show what the best practices are?
Yes and no. Some of the studies have been replicated in Australia with Australian context and Australian students, but not consistently across all of the areas. Certainly the US has quite a strong research interest, and that's where some of the leading academics in the world are based, and also where some of those researchers have received very significant support and funding to be able to carry out very large-scale, high-quality studies. In Australia, we have a breadth of research, but in many cases, they often tend to be smaller samples, single school contexts and things like that. And that provides a way to help illustrate some of the issues, but that's certainly something where, you know, I'd love to be able to see some more research happen to, you know, to really get a good, strong sense of how it can work in here. As much as possible, though, in the research, in the literature review, I tried, wherever possible, firstly to go for high quality, methodologically rigorous studies, but in particular to look at student samples in those studies that were probably comparable to the types of students in our public schools. There's not much value in taking all of the findings, maybe from a study conducted in an international high SES, private or independent school context, and then transferring that to some of our schools. They're those types of things where you need to take some caution in how you interpret the findings.
How does the research actually compare to countries, Scandinavian countries, that do not have any discrepancy in relation to their education system, and yet they are the high achievers in CESE?
That's a really interesting point you raised there. A lot of the attention that gets provided around some of the Scandinavian countries is about the average, the middle. They have quite high averages compared to other or comparable contexts, but not always at the high end or the highest achievement end either. And that's something that certainly I was fortunate enough to visit Denmark a couple of years ago for a conference, and talking to teachers and education people from some of those countries, got immensely frustrated, saying, oh, the whole world thinks Scandinavia has the solution here. We're crying out for support to help support high achieving students. Some of the probably better, more comparable examples of nations that have improved the percentage of students in the high achieving range includes parts of Great Britain and Ireland. Also in Asia, countries like Singapore, Japan and South Korea have very significant examples of where not only do they have large percentages of students achieving in the highest ranges for the same age, but also in some cases have improved the overall percentage that exists there. So it's an interesting one. I often sort of smirk a little bit when you hear the discussion of Finland, and realistically that's a classic example of it really depends on which statistics or which part of the overall curve you look at.